This is Fast Forward, where we're looking at some of the longer-term implications of the pandemic for our UK customers and speaking with some big-picture thinkers from inside and outside of Google. We're joined by Ben Page, CEO of Ipsos MORI, the polling and research company. He consults with business leaders across the UK, and I started by asking him what's the conversation he's having with them.
First thing is just the level of uncertainty and but also reminding people that while we like to talk about the new world where nobody will ever go into a central office ever again and where commuting will have now ceased forever and all of this sort of thing, first of all, just acknowledging that actually most predictions about the future tend to be wrong. And I'm not sure that COVID-19 would have made them any more accurate. And secondly, that although our behavior has changed dramatically with things like the digital acceleration of the last few months, when you look at underlying human needs and human values, those often change much, much more slowly. And so, a few months in lockdown does not lead to a complete change in human society. And indeed, there are certain things we can show you that when you go back to the 1990s, nothing has actually changed in terms of those sorts of values, whether it's thinking you're overwhelmed by technology or how ambitious people are in their careers. Some of those things just haven't changed at all in 20 or 30 years. So it doesn't mean that everything's going to have changed in a few months.
How do you think social attitudes are changing because of the pandemic?
Well, I would look at the things again that in a sense that were there already and are likely to have been exacerbated by the pandemic and the lockdown and then what's happened afterwards. So one was an expectation of an activist government. And even before the crisis in 2019, we had many more people saying they wanted the government to spend more, even if it meant putting up taxes. Many more people than a decade before who were worried that government wasn't going to do enough to look after them. And indeed, you saw in the general election of 2019, a Conservative promising to spend a lot more on health, education, policing, etc. You then have just a few months later, a Conservative government employing 8.9 million people directly via the coronavirus job retention scheme. There's been more polarisation in terms of incomes, with people earning over £55,000 a year tending to save money during lockdown, but everybody, and of course median earnings are a lot less than that, everybody below that getting, and the poorer you were before the lockdown, the more likely you were to become even poorer during lockdown. And so I think that expectation that government does something, and again, we've seen that, but you'll have an activist government. We already wanted that, so I think you'll see that. I think demands for brands to have purpose, they were there before. There is that pressure isn't going to go away when people are feeling under pressure. And those companies and brands that can respond best to how consumers will be feeling will be the ones that will tend to prosper in this situation. After the 2008 crash, for example, we saw supermarkets all over the world being seen as doing a better job than government, interestingly, according to the public, because they showed that they really got people were, living on squeezed incomes after 2008. So we'll see I think we'll see those things again. Plus, of course, the digital acceleration that we've seen where, we were moving online, but there's been a massive speed up over the last few months. And a lot of those new habits for certain people trying online shopping, banking for the first time, we're going to see that the death of the high street or the reconfiguration of the high street. Those things, I think, are going to be accelerated and will stick as well.
How will attitudes to sustainability change?
On sustainability, we thought before the crisis, that me being a silly fool, I thought before the crisis, this was going to be the cut-through year when people globally, agreed that there was a problem. And certainly they still do in the polls. We've got more agreement over the threat of climate change than anything else we measure pretty much globally. And so I thought with Greta Thunberg having more searches for her name than Beyonce last year, that Extinction Rebellion had got their point over, and we'd seen real willingness to finally see some dramatic shifts. What's happened in the immediate aftermath of the first part of the coronavirus epidemic is that spontaneous anxiety about climate change, as in 2008, has fallen markedly as people start to worry more about the here and now and the near term and the economy. So 7 out of 10 consumers globally and in Britain say they want a green rebuild, and they want any rebuild to be focused on the big long-term challenge of climate change. But if you force them to choose between the economy and sustainability and climate change, then I'm afraid the public is still pretty split over that. If there's a trade-off. Now, many people, of course, will argue that a Green New Deal that invests in green energy, green infrastructure, etc., will actually create jobs and have all sorts of benefits. We need to wait and see. I think this is a key point I can't make enough, that because we're human beings, we look for patterns in the present and the near term and the recent past, and then we rapidly extrapolate those trends through into the future. We can't help ourselves. It's what we do. In 2016, we see Brexit, we see Trump, and we build ourselves a narrative about how a populist revolution is going to overtake the world. And so now, we're in a way too close to the trees to see the forest. We are just in the middle of it all. We just don't really know. And when I look at politics, for example, the aftermath of the 2008 crash, in terms of what it meant politically, didn't really start to become apparent until after, 4 or 5 years after the actual crash itself. And then, of course, eventually you see many of the rise, the full-throated rise of populism across the West. So where we go on sustainability, not clear, but because I know that carbon emissions are rising in China, rising in Europe, as they did in 2008. But I personally, it's one thing I do hope that perhaps we can take time to pause and think about what sort of rebuild we have.
What's your advice for UK businesses as they look to the long term?
We're going into a recession, so we're going to see people. It is likely that people will continue to be scared of the virus, and therefore they may, even as things reopen, they may not want to go out and spend money in quite the same way. That will be, of course, added to by the fact that lots of people will be worried about their jobs. We are likely to see, high unemployment by recent standards. And so for that, you've got that sort of double whammy in terms of consumer spending. So brands that are about, DIY, staying at home, we can see a lot of cocooning, simple pleasures, almost a nostalgic time, and to a certain extent, where people are perhaps cocooning away from things. They aren't going out and spending in quite the same way. And they're cooking more at home than eating out. And certainly our restaurant industry looks to be pretty heavily reshaped. And so that certainly is one scenario for the near term. Plus, people, if it's like 2008, shifting down from more expensive purchases to cheaper ones in each area of expenditure. And again, that looks perfectly possible given the squeeze that we're going to have on a large part of the population's incomes. But the other thing I think I would say is, frankly, because we know prediction is so hard, and because we know that most predictions are wrong, what one might want to make sure you're doing, and we see a lot of interest in this, and that is scenario planning. Building those, so build yourself your scenario of the V-shaped recovery, even if it's looking a bit less likely by the day. Build yourself the scenario of what a U-shaped recovery looks like for you. Build yourself a scenario where perhaps we do see a more distributed workforce that commutes less, where offices are less popular and less in demand, where perhaps expensive housing in big cities is a bit less in demand, because you can get you've got a more distributed workforce, which actually improves quality of life in some ways and allows some rebalancing geographically of the UK economy. So build those different scenarios and then look for the signals that they're starting to come true. So, anecdotally, I can see lots of people saying that the leases on their offices are up and they're all just going to go to virtual working. In fact, I've done that in Oxford. Our Oxford office no longer exists. The lease expired during lockdown. And I just said, well, as you're all at home anyway, and we aren't using an office, we'll rent some temporary space if you need it. I moved out, another team, we've moved out of a WeWork space because so few people are now coming into our offices in central London that we have, whereas before we were in complete overflow, now there's all the space in the world that they could possibly want. So build those different scenarios in as permanent things, but don't be too wedded to any of them, because I think, it might be that if we get a vaccine next year, 2022 may just seem, quote unquote, normal again. And so we just need to be careful. And, there were lots of predictions after 2008 that we would all live simple lives and bling would go out of fashion. And as Instagram shows us, that didn't happen.
Where should marketers be looking for opportunity?
To a certain extent, it depends what you're trying to market, but I think this is a chance for consumers to take stock of their spending, of their choices. There's a campaign on financial well-being that I'm involved with, and we're saying, well, look, there's a massive increase there's going to be a massive increase in people running out of money, thinking about how they manage their debts, thinking about their spending, and so using that as an opportunity, in a sense, to disrupt people's behaviour. So that can work in a number of ways. If you're a challenger brand, this might be, as we come out of lockdown and people start to reappraise their lives rather than just being in a completely defensive mode while while we were in lockdown. As we start to reopen, there is there is a moment of disruption to a certain extent where people will be coming back out, opening their eyes to new things. So that's certainly something I think for people to think about. But at the same time, remember that we want brands that we empathize with, that we can connect with, brands that understand us, which is why supermarkets did so well after 2008. So showing empathy to the circumstances that people are going to find themselves in will also be hugely important. And yes, digital will be massive because, of course, of the acceleration that we've seen over the last 3 months.
A lot to unpack there in terms of attitudes towards sustainability, towards government, and of course towards brands. For me, the biggest takeout is around scenario planning, and not just looking to predict the future, but to plan for the various different futures that might come true, and then look for the signals that are indicating whether they are or not. At Google, we are here to help with this, of course. If you are a small business, check out Google Open for Business online to see all of our resources for small and medium-sized businesses there. And if you're a bigger business, speak to your Google team about what we can do in terms of insights and support for your scenario planning. Thanks very much.